Let me share with you some of the research. There hasn't been a lot, and I want to share with you just some of the work that I did for as part of my PhD and a little bit beyond. The first research that really was able to deal with the paradox of self-esteem, of how some people get so much accolade and yet their self-esteem decreases, or how some people who have high self-esteem are hostile versus others are generous and benevolent. The first research that was done was by Kernis, who back in 1995 came up with the concept of self-esteem stability. And he said what actually can predict whether a person will be hostile or generous, whether their self-esteem over time will be high or whether it will lower over time, is not self-esteem per se, but rather it's the stability of their self-esteem. And what he showed, and he followed people, for example, for a week or 2 weeks, and he would measure their state rather than trait, their state self-esteem at the time. So there were certain people who, if this is self-esteem level and this is time, there were people whose self-esteem at this point was here, and then the next day here, and then here, and then here again, and then here, and here, and here. And he measured it, let's say, 10 times. And what he wanted to see was to measure the standard deviation of this spread. How close was it? How stable was it? So this would be someone with maybe on average high self-esteem, but with a lot of fluctuations. Other people were more like this. Again, ups and downs, but sometimes large fluctuations, but overall pretty stable. Same level of self-esteem, trait self-esteem, but state self-esteem fluctuated far less. And what he showed was that it was the stability rather than self-esteem per se that determined whether or not the person would be hostile or benevolent. People with unstable self-esteem were more likely to be hostile. People with more stable self-esteem were more likely to be generous and benevolent. Resolving a lot of the contradictions, misunderstanding in the literature. When I saw this, I had a personal eureka experience, and I said, this is it. He's onto something. And what I did in my master's thesis back in 2000 was create a questionnaire, a very simple questionnaire that measured dependent versus independent self-esteem. And I measured students, it was mostly Harvard students. I did it also cross-sectional in Singapore. I was spending a lot of time there at the time. Similar results, Asia and here, at least in Singapore and in the United States. And what I found was that dependent self-esteem was associated with instability. Independent self-esteem was associated with stability. In other words, I came up with one measure that instead of measuring 10 times whether that kind of self-esteem will lead to hostility or anxiety versus calmness or generosity, I used just one measure. And that's what I found. Very high correlation between dependent self-esteem and self-esteem instability, positive correlation, and a positive correlation between independent self-esteem and self-esteem stability. Then some of my students at the time did research on it. For example, Melissa Cristino, who you'll meet, at least some of her writing later on in this class, did her senior thesis as an undergrad here on showing the connection between independent self-esteem and happiness, and independent self-esteem and flow. Those who had high independent self-esteem were most likely to experience flow on the athletic field, which is where her research was, Harvard Athletics. Also connected to higher levels of happiness. But my dissertation was trying to pin down these exact characteristics that were problematic in the self-esteem literature. Remember, high self-esteem means narcissism. How do you differentiate? Well, what I found in the dissertation was that narcissism is connected actually to high dependent self-esteem. There was no correlation between independent self-esteem and narcissism. When it comes to generosity, this was probably the most surprising result of the study. People with independent self-esteem were actually more generous and benevolent, both in terms of self-report and in terms of their actual behavior toward other people. A strong sense of self. Remember, love your neighbor as you love yourself. Do not do unto others what you would not have done unto yourself. And when you have a high standard for the self, there's a high standard for the other. And that usually happens automatically, because we mirror our behavior toward the I. And then hostility. No correlation between hostility and self-esteem per se, because some people with high self-esteem have high levels of hostility. Some people with high self-esteem have low levels of hostility and more generosity. But dependent and independent self-esteem predicted hostility. Those with high self-esteem that was mostly dependent were more likely, not always, not every person, but on average were more likely to display hostility. Those people with high self-esteem that is mostly independent were much more open, cooperative, and generous. Perfectionism. Two of my students at that time, Tiffany Ignaziak and Kate Ritchie, who's a TF in this class, did fantastic work showing the connection between perfectionism and self-esteem. How people with high independent self-esteem were less likely to be perfectionistic. Why? Because it's about self-expression. It's about constantly learning and growing, and part of learning and growing is falling down and getting up again. No other way to learn. Whereas dependent self-esteem were more concerned, the words of Mike Moldavano that I quoted last time, we say we want the truth. What we mean is that we want to be correct. More dependent on how they're perceived, more perfectionistic, more afraid of failure. So, this applies also, and we've talked about it before, but I just want to point it out again, to relationships. Best work on the topic, David Schnarch again, where he talks about how do we get to the stage of being known rather than being validated. And that doesn't mean that at the age of 70 or 80, when we're fully evolved, we don't enjoy or need at times the validation of our partner. We do. But at the same time, we're much more about self-expression. Here is what David Schnarch has to say. Differentiation is your ability to maintain your sense of self when you're emotionally and or physically close to others, especially as they become increasingly important to you. Differentiation permits you to maintain your own course when lovers, friends, and family pressure you to agree and conform. Well-differentiated people can agree without feeling like they're losing themselves, and can disagree without feeling alienated and embittered. This is what being known is all about. Being yourself, being differentiated. This is what independent self-esteem is. This is what ultimately interdependence is all about. Easier said than done. But again, it's very helpful to have that as a heuristic at the back of your mind, to notice it when it's happening. Because at the age of 20, you're also experiencing moments of interdependence, real connection with a friend, with family, just walking in the yard and admiring the beauty of it all. And these are precious moments that over time we can have more and more of, if we follow the natural path, the natural evolution. Going back to the analogy of walking, I mean, very often when we know these, stories through history, that people were put in, shoes that were too small for them, or were not allowed to try and walk, such as very often the case was in the Romanian under Ceausescu, where people were not allowed to develop naturally. When our natural development is hindered, and it can be hindered, we don't evolve as we can. So the question is, also on the psychological level, how can we evolve as we can? And some of the tools that you learned throughout the semester, whether it was the cognitive tool of learning the permission to be human, or the tools that you can actually apply, such as keeping a journal, such as exercising, such as doing the gratitude exercise, such as meditating or doing yoga. All these things, as you'll see, are ways of becoming more self-actualized, of expediting the process. And when we expedite the process, it means that right now, right here, we're able to experience that sense of being much more often. We don't need to wait till we're 50 or 60 or 70. We can be on that healthy journey way before that.